Hello, my name is Joseph Inouye, and today I'm going to be presenting my portfolio project on my visit to the Japanese American Museum. Thank you. After the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, many Japanese citizens were either recruited by companies to help replace Chinese labor or fled to America in search of a better life. Unfortunately, to the Japanese surprise, their lives being classified as aliens ineligible for citizenship had just begun. After the immigration, and in 1909, most of the Japanese population in America lived in California as farmers. These people were known as Issei, which in Japanese means First Japanese American Generation. Without much discrimination, they thrived in California, forming co-op alliances to expand their land and sell their crops into various markets. This intuition had a significant impact on the development of agriculture in the West, as they heavily contributed to the American economy. However, as the Japanese farmers kept expanding their land, the anti-Japanese sentiment began to grow. In 1913, the first Alien Land Law Act was passed, restricting the Japanese from owning land in California. Although anti-Japanese sentiment was still growing, which ultimately limited Japanese immigrants to America, some Japanese could still find their ways to come to America. These people were primarily women and were known as picture brides. Picture brides were women who were married in Japan through arranged marriages that were later able to join their husbands in America. They were known as picture brides because they exchanged photos and letters with their future husbands, eventually joining their husbands in America after long periods of time. It was a chance for Japanese women to have a traditional marriage and escape a life of poverty. Due to arranged marriages in Japan, many women came to America, which dramatically helped family life and community growth, expanding the Japanese culture and population. However, due to the growing anti-Japanese sentiment in 1920, Japanese women were no longer allowed to join their families in America. Then, in 1922, the Cable Act law was passed, which stated that any woman who married a Japanese Issei would be stripped of their citizenship. And finally, in 1924, Congress passed an Immigration Act which banned Japanese immigration. Many Issei were devastated by these new laws as the country was supposed to embody freedom. Civil rights were not even recognized to them, as they were considered aliens, not citizens. Although things seemed hopeless for the Issei in America, this did not slow down the Japanese morale to thrive in this new country. Many Issei joined Japanese American organizations, which were created as havens for many Japanese Americans to help overcome the discriminations and adversities together. Gatherings would generally occur in churches or temples that hosted Japanese celebrations and ceremonies, while also doubling as a community center. These communities thrived as they also served as an educational center to the Nisei, Nisei are known as Second Japanese American Generation, teaching them language and culture. From social support to direct fundraising for businesses, these Japanese Americans came together to support one another in these harsh and rough times. Unfortunately, this would be short-lived. On December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked by Japan, which ultimately led to the U.S.'s entry into World War II. Already having strong hate towards Japanese Americans, Franklin Roosevelt, the president at the time, in fear of traitors and national threats, would pass, without due process, Executive 9066. Executive 9066 stated that all persons of national threats, in this case Japanese Americans, were required to relocate to relocation centers further inland. These would later be known as concentration camps. There were 10 camps in total, in which Manzanar, where my grandmother stayed, was the most populated. During the relocation process, many Japanese American community leaders, teachers, and religious leaders were directly jailed by the FBI, seen as hazardous people. At the same time, due to the incarceration, over 120,000 Japanese Americans lost their jobs, freedoms, lives, and civil rights, stripped of the life they once had. Surrounded by miles of barbed wire and armed guards, many Japanese Americans had to deal with lack of privacy, cramped living conditions, harsh weather conditions, and starvation until the war was over, which wouldn't occur for another 3 years. Betrayed by their country after showing consistent loyalty, the Japanese Americans still decided to remain loyal. American soldiers told the Japanese people that if they enlisted in the army and joined the war, it would prove their loyalty to America. This then saw thousands of Japanese Americans enlist in the army, contributing significantly to the United States war effort. Home to some of the bravest soldiers I have read about, the 442nd Regiment, a segregated unit composed of all Japanese soldiers, fought on the front lines in World War II, representing America. These men believed that fighting for their country would prove their loyalty to America. They also fought for the good of their family's name and community. The 442nd Regiment has had the most casualties, but is also the most decorated unit throughout American history. While the war and incarceration were happening, Japanese and American civil rights activists confronted the United States government for forcefully removing the Japanese Americans from society. Civil rights activists known as Mitsu Endo, Clara Breed, John Burns, and many more stood up against the anti-Japanese sentiment by protesting against the incarceration and taking legal action against the government. After the war was finally over, all the concentration camps were stopped, and the Japanese Americans were free. However, they weren't really free as they had no place to go and they had no money to work with. The only thing the American government gave the Japanese Americans was $25 and a train ticket. For 3 years of incarceration, $25 and a train ticket would barely do anything for these people, leaving many lives in shambles. However, despite the adversities, many Japanese Americans fled back to California to restart their lives. Although the war was over and the Japanese were released from prison camps, discrimination and prejudice still existed. It was not until the late 1900s that civil rights activists and countless protests would eliminate most discrimination towards the Japanese Americans. Overall, the museum visit was great and very eye-opening. I loved learning more about my Japanese side and how strong their morale was through times like these. Reading about their history inspires me to persevere through life even when times are tough, and also made me aware of the tragedies that they face. Finally, I would like to thank Mr. Beeman for assigning the portfolio project, because without it, I probably would have never visited the Japanese American Museum. Thanks for listening.